"She is under my protection," said the Vampire King when they tried to hurt her. "Hello, everyone. Before we begin today's story, I have a small favor to ask. Please hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our channel's new videos. It is quick, free, and the best way to support us in bringing you more dramatic stories. Your support means the world to us. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much." The night air over Manhattan carried the quiet hum of traffic and distant sirens, but inside the Grand Aurora restaurant the world felt completely different. Crystal chandeliers glowed softly above polished marble floors, and the scent of expensive wine filled the air. Wealthy guests sat beneath golden lights, laughing quietly as servers moved through the room like shadows, trying not to disturb the delicate balance of power that ruled the place. Emily Carter held a silver tray carefully in both hands as she walked between the tables. Her shoes were worn and her uniform was slightly too large, but she kept her posture straight and her expression calm. She had worked 2 shifts already that day, and her feet felt like stone, but she could not afford mistakes. Not tonight, not in a place like this. Table 17 ordered another bottle, she whispered to herself, glancing toward the raised platform at the center of the dining hall. That table was different. Everyone knew it. The staff spoke about it in low voices because the man who sat there was not just another wealthy guest. His name was Alexander Voss, and even among the powerful people of New York his presence carried a strange gravity. Some called him a billionaire, some called him a genius, others simply lowered their voices and said nothing at all. Emily had only seen him once before from a distance. He had been sitting perfectly still while others spoke around him, a tall man with dark hair, pale skin, and eyes so calm they felt colder than winter wind, the kind of man who did not need to raise his voice because the room already belonged to him. Tonight, he was back. Emily could feel it before she even looked toward the table. There was a strange silence in that corner of the restaurant, as if the air itself was careful not to move. She approached slowly, holding the wine bottle steady. "Good evening, sir," she said softly as she reached the table. "May I refill your glass?" Alexander Voss did not answer immediately. His gaze lifted slowly, meeting hers for only a brief moment. But in that single second, Emily felt something she could not explain. His eyes were not angry or cruel. They were simply ancient, as if he had seen centuries pass like ordinary days. She lowered her gaze quickly, remembering the first rule of this job: do not stare at the powerful guests. But before she could step away, a loud voice shattered the quiet atmosphere. Well, look at this." A hand suddenly grabbed Emily by the wrist. The grip was rough and careless. She gasped as the silver tray slipped slightly in her hands. A man from the neighboring table had stood up, swaying slightly from too much alcohol. His expensive suit was wrinkled and his face was red with irritation. "You spilled wine near my table earlier," he said sharply. "Maybe you should come with me and apologize properly." His fingers tightened painfully around her arm. Emily tried to pull away. "Sir, I am sorry if there was a mistake, but I have to continue working." The restaurant manager glanced toward them from across the room, but did not move. The guest was too important, too wealthy. No one wanted to interfere. The man laughed and began pulling Emily toward the hallway that led to the private rooms. "You work for tips, right? Then you should be grateful I am giving you attention." The room grew quiet. Conversations faded. Several guests watched, but no one stepped forward. Emily felt panic rising in her chest. Her heart pounded as she struggled against the grip, but the man was stronger. "Please let go," she said, her voice shaking. "I do not want any trouble." Her words echoed weakly in the silence. Then suddenly another voice spoke from behind them, calm, cold, absolute. "Release her." The command was quiet, but it carried through the entire dining hall like the edge of a blade. The man froze, turning slowly toward the sound. At the center table, Alexander Voss had risen from his chair. No one had seen him stand. No one had heard his footsteps. Yet suddenly, he was there, tall and still, his dark suit absorbing the light around him. His eyes now glowed faintly in the golden glow of the chandeliers. The air in the room felt colder. The man holding Emily frowned, trying to laugh it off. "And who do you think you are?" Alexander Voss stepped forward slowly. Each movement was calm, precise, and controlled, as if the entire world had already agreed to move out of his way before he even began walking. When he stopped beside Emily, his gaze shifted toward the man gripping her arm, and then in a voice that carried quiet power, older than the city itself, he said, "She is under my protection." The dining hall remained frozen after Alexander Voss spoke. Those words settled over the room like falling snow. Quiet but impossible to ignore. Emily Carter stood motionless, her wrists still trapped in the grip of the drunken guest. But something had changed. The man no longer looked confident. The color drained slowly from his face as he stared at the tall figure standing beside her. Alexander Voss did not raise his voice. He did not repeat the command. Yet the air around him felt heavier, colder, as if the temperature of the entire restaurant had dropped several degrees. The chandeliers above continued to glow, but their warm light no longer felt comforting. Release her, Alexander said again, his tone calm, steady, and final. The man holding Emily laughed nervously, trying to recover his pride. You cannot tell me what to do. This is none of your business. His voice sounded louder than necessary, the way frightened men often speak when they are trying to convince themselves they are still in control. But his hand loosened slightly around Emily's wrist. Despite his words, Alexander Voss tilted his head just a little, studying him. In that moment, every person in the restaurant understood something without needing it explained. The man who had spoken was not someone who asked twice. I believe it is my business, Alexander said quietly. You are causing fear in a place that values peace. The guest sneered. I am a paying customer. I can do whatever I want in this restaurant. Several diners shifted uncomfortably in their seats. The manager still stood near the service counter, pretending to examine a stack of menus, while carefully avoiding eye contact with anyone involved. Emily felt her pulse racing. She had never experienced silence like this before. It felt as if the entire building was waiting for the next breath. Alexander slowly reached forward and placed 2 fingers lightly on the man's wrist. The movement was gentle, almost polite, yet the effect was immediate. The man gasped and released Emily, as if his hand had touched ice. She stepped backward, quickly clutching her sore arm and staring in confusion. The man staggered half a step back, rubbing his wrist. What did you just do? He demanded. Nothing, Alexander replied simply. I merely helped you make the correct decision. A ripple of whispers passed through several tables. A woman in a black evening gown leaned toward the man beside her and murmured, Did you see that? The man shook his head slowly, as if he had witnessed something he could not quite understand. The drunken guest looked around the room, realizing suddenly that the audience was no longer on his side. His confidence crumbled into irritation. You think you are better than everyone else, he snapped. I know people in this city, powerful people. Alexander's gaze never wavered. That may be true, he said calmly, but tonight you are the one who should leave. The man opened his mouth to argue again, but something in Alexander's eyes made him stop. It was not anger, it was something deeper, older, and far more dangerous. Slowly the guest backed away from the table, straightened his jacket, and muttered a few angry words under his breath before turning toward the exit. No one stopped him. The door closed behind him with a quiet click, and the tension in the room loosened like a rope finally cut. Emily realized she had been holding her breath. She exhaled slowly and looked up at the man who had just changed the course of her night. Alexander Voss turned toward her fully for the first time. His expression was unreadable, but his voice carried a calm authority. Are you hurt? Emily shook her head quickly. No, sir, I am fine. Thank you for helping me. He studied her carefully, noticing the faint red mark on her wrist where the man had grabbed her, and the slight tremble still lingering in her hands. What is your name? He asked. Emily Carter, she replied softly. I work here as a server. Alexander nodded once, as if committing the name to memory. Then he reached for the wine bottle still resting on her tray and placed it back onto the table with deliberate care. Emily noticed something strange as he moved his hand, paused for a moment near her arm, and his eyes narrowed slightly, as though he had sensed something unusual. The faint scent of blood from a small cut on her finger drifted through the air, unnoticed by everyone else in the room except him. For a fraction of a second, Alexander Voss became perfectly still. The quiet expression on his face changed into something sharper, more alert. His gaze lowered to her injured hand, and the faintest flicker of crimson passed through his eyes before fading again. Emily did not notice the change, but several guests across the room did. They exchanged uneasy glances, whispering quietly to one another, because something about the moment felt important, though none of them understood why. Alexander lifted his gaze again, meeting Emily's eyes with renewed intensity. Miss Carter, he said slowly, it seems tonight may be more complicated than either of us expected. Emily Carter did not understand why the man standing in front of her suddenly seemed so focused on the small cut on her finger. To her, it was nothing more than a shallow scratch from a broken glass earlier in the evening, but Alexander Voss remained completely still, as if that tiny drop of blood had frozen time itself around them. The restaurant slowly began to return to life. Conversations resumed in cautious whispers, glasses clinked softly against polished tables, yet an invisible circle of silence still surrounded the place where Emily and Alexander stood. The wealthy guests were watching, pretending not to watch. Alexander straightened slightly, and his expression returned to calm control. Though the brief flash of crimson in his eyes had not been imagination, he could smell it clearly, now human blood, fresh and warm, drifting through the air, like a signal no one else could hear except him. That alone should not have been remarkable. After 6 centuries of existence, he had encountered thousands of humans, and their fragile bodies bled easily. But this scent was different. There was something hidden inside. It's something ancient and familiar, buried beneath the surface like a memory, waiting to awaken. Emily shifted her weight nervously, holding her tray again. "I should return to work, sir," she said softly. "I have other tables waiting." Alexander did not move for a moment. Instead, he studied her face with quiet intensity. "Emily Carter," he repeated slowly. "Yes, sir," she answered, wondering why her name sounded different when he said it, as if the words carried more weight than usual. "Your hand," he said calmly. "Let me see it." She hesitated for a brief moment, but something in his tone felt less like a request and more like a certainty. She extended her hand slightly. The cut was small, just a thin line across her finger. Where the broken glass had grazed her skin, a faint bead of red still lingered at the edge of the wound. Alexander leaned closer, not enough to frighten her, but enough that he could examine it clearly. The scent of that single drop reached him again, and the strange sensation inside his chest sharpened like a distant echo awakening from sleep. Impossible, he thought silently, yet the mark beneath the skin of his own wrist stirred faintly, reacting to the presence of her blood. He had not felt that ancient magic move in centuries. His hand tightened slightly at his side, controlling the instinct that told him to look deeper. A server standing nearby whispered to another employee, "Did you see how he stopped the man earlier?" The second worker nodded nervously. "That was not normal. No one touches a guest like that, especially not someone like him." Their quiet conversation drifted across the room, along with the whispers of other diners who had begun speculating about the strange encounter. Some believed the powerful businessman had simply defended a young server. Others sensed something more unusual. In the calm way he commanded the room, Alexander finally released his focus from Emily's hand. "You should clean that wound," he said quietly. "There is a first aid cabinet near the service hall." Emily nodded. "Yes, sir. Thank you again for helping me earlier. You did not have to intervene." Alexander looked toward the main entrance where the drunken guest had disappeared into the New York night. "A person should never ignore injustice," he replied calmly, "especially when it happens directly in front of them." Emily blinked, slightly surprised by the answer. Most wealthy guests never spoke about fairness. They spoke about influence, money, and power, but not justice. She gave a small, polite smile before preparing to step away, but just as she turned, her tray shifted and the small cut on her finger brushed lightly against Alexander's hand. The contact lasted less than a second. A single drop of her blood touched his skin. The reaction was immediate. Alexander's body froze, as if struck by lightning. Beneath the surface of his pale wrist, something ancient flared to life. A faint golden pattern began forming under his skin, glowing like embers beneath ice. Across the dining room, 2 elegantly dressed guests suddenly rose from their chairs in alarm. Their eyes widened as they recognized the impossible sight. One of them whispered in a trembling voice, "The mark, it cannot be." Another guest turned sharply toward Alexander's wrist, staring with disbelief, because the symbol glowing beneath his skin had not appeared in the vampire world for more than 200 years, and now it was awakening again because of a single human waitress standing quietly in the center of the restaurant. The golden light beneath Alexander Voss' wrist pulsed, once then faded beneath his skin, but the effect it created in the room did not disappear. 2 elegantly dressed guests who had stood from their table continued staring at him with expressions that mixed disbelief with quiet fear. They were not ordinary patrons enjoying a luxury dinner. They were members of an old world that rarely revealed itself to humans, and they understood exactly what they had just witnessed. One of them, a tall woman with silver hair, whispered under her breath, "The mark has awakened again." Her companion, a man with sharp features and calm gray eyes, answered quietly, "That should not be possible. The last time the blood oath reacted was more than 2 centuries ago." Their voices were low enough that no human in the restaurant noticed, but the tension between them spread like a silent ripple through several other tables where certain guests had suddenly stopped eating and turned their attention toward Alexander. Emily Carter however, remained completely unaware of the storm. Building around her, she had already lowered her tray and stepped back slightly. "I am sorry," she said nervously. "I did not mean to spill anything or cause trouble." Her voice sounded small compared with the heavy silence surrounding them. Alexander did not respond immediately. His gaze remained fixed on his wrist, where the faint memory of the golden pattern had just appeared beneath his skin. He slowly turned his hand, as if confirming the mark had vanished again. The ancient magic had retreated, but he could still feel the echo of its power moving quietly through his veins like a distant heartbeat. 600 years, he thought, 6 centuries, without a single reaction from that forgotten oath. Yet one drop of this girl blood had awakened at his attention. Returned to Emily Carter. She looked exactly as she had a moment earlier, a young woman in a simple black uniform holding a serving tray and trying not to draw attention to herself. There was nothing outwardly extraordinary about her, no sign that she carried anything unusual within her blood, yet the magic had spoken clearly. Alexander Voss rarely felt surprise, but now a quiet sense of curiosity sharpened behind his calm expression. "Miss Carter," he said slowly, "did your family ever live in Europe?" Emily blinked in confusion. "Europe? No, sir, I grew up in Ohio. My mother moved to New York when I finished high school. Why do you ask?" Alexander studied her face, searching for any trace of recognition, but she appeared genuinely puzzled. The answer confirmed what he suspected. If she carried the bloodline connected to the ancient oath, she did not know it. Before he could speak again, the 2 elegant guests who had noticed the mark approached his table. The silver-haired woman stopped a few feet away and inclined her head respectfully. "Lord Voss," she said softly, "may we have a word?" Alexander did not look at her immediately. Instead, he continued watching Emily Carter for another moment, as if memorizing her presence in the room. Finally, he turned toward the woman and spoke without raising his voice. "Not here." The woman nodded, understanding his meaning. Human ears filled the restaurant, and whatever they needed to discuss could not be spoken openly. She glanced once toward Emily, her eyes lingering with quiet curiosity, then stepped back to rejoin her companion across the dining hall. A few other guests who belonged to the same hidden world exchanged silent signals with one another. Their movements were subtle, but meaningful. The mark had been seen. The information would spread quickly. Emily shifted her tray again, unsure whether she should remain or leave. "Sir, I really should return to my tables now. The manager will not be happy if I keep standing here." Alexander nodded once. "Yes, you should continue your work for now." The final 2 words carried a weight Emily did not understand, but she smiled politely. "Anyway, thank you again for helping me earlier," she said. Then she turned and walked toward the service corridor, disappearing behind a polished wooden door that led to the staff hallway. Alexander watched until she was gone. The moment the door closed, the silver-haired woman returned to his side. Her composure carefully controlled. "My lord," she said quietly, "I believe you know what we witnessed." Alexander's gaze moved toward the empty doorway where Emily had disappeared. "Yes," he replied calmly, "the blood oath has awakened again." The man beside the woman inhaled sharply. "But that oath binds your life to a human bloodline." Alexander's expression remained unreadable. "That is correct." The man hesitated, then spoke the question neither of them wanted to ask. "If the oath has chosen her, what does that mean for the throne?" Alexander Voss' eyes turned slowly toward the dark window where the lights of Manhattan glittered against the night sky. "It means," he said quietly, "that the human girl in this restaurant may now be the most important person in the vampire world." Inside the staff corridor, the noise of the dining hall faded into a distant murmur. Emily Carter walked quickly past the storage shelves and stainless steel counters, trying to calm the strange feeling in her chest. Her wrists still ached from where the drunken guest had grabbed her, but that was not what troubled her. The image that stayed in her mind was the expression on Alexander Voss' face when their hands touched. For a brief second, he had looked shocked, not angry, not annoyed, shocked, as if something impossible had happened. She stepped into the small employee break room and set her tray down on the counter. One of the cooks glanced up from a cup of coffee. "Rough night out there," he said with a half-tired smile. Emily exhaled slowly. "You could say that." Another server, named Rachel, leaned against the refrigerator with curiosity in her eyes. "I saw what happened," Rachel said quietly. "That guy who grabbed you is known for causing trouble." "You are lucky." Mr. Voss stepped in. Emily frowned slightly. "Do you know him?" Rachel laughed softly. "Everyone in this place knows him, at least the important guests do. The staff mostly just try to stay out of his way. They say he owns half the buildings in Manhattan." Emily shook her head. "I have never seen someone stop a room like that before." Rachel lowered her voice even more. "Some people say He is not just rich, they say he is dangerous. Emily raised an eyebrow. Dangerous? How? Rachel shrugged. I do not know exactly. My cousin works security at another club downtown. She told me that people who cross him disappear from the business world overnight. No lawsuits, no scandals, they are just gone. Emily did not know whether to believe that story, but something about the calm authority in Alexander's voice earlier made the rumor feel less like gossip and more like a warning. She moved to the sink and rinsed the small cut on her finger under cool running water. The thin line of blood had almost disappeared now, but as she touched it, a faint warmth spread through her hand. She frowned. That was strange. It felt as if the skin beneath the wound pulsed once like a heartbeat. Emily wrapped a small bandage around her finger and returned to the dining room, carrying a fresh tray of glasses. The moment she stepped back into the hall, she sensed the difference immediately. Conversations had resumed, but the atmosphere remained tense. Several guests kept glancing toward Alexander Voss' table, where he still sat perfectly composed, as if nothing unusual had happened, yet the silver-haired woman and her companion had not returned to their seats. They stood near the far wall, speaking quietly with two other elegantly dressed patrons. Their eyes occasionally shifted toward Emily. Every time she moved through the room, she could feel their attention following her like invisible threads. What is going on tonight? She whispered to herself. Meanwhile, at the central table, Alexander Voss sat motionless, while the quiet discussion continued behind him. The silver-haired woman finally approached again, her voice barely above a whisper. My lord, the others have confirmed it. They all felt the surge when the mark appeared. Alexander's gaze remained forward. I expected as much. The man beside her spoke with concern. If the blood oath truly recognized her, then the ancient covenant has chosen its human again. That has not happened in more than 200 years. Alexander slowly folded his hands on the table. The oath was created to protect a single bloodline, he said calmly. If that bloodline survives, then the magic must answer when it senses their blood. The silver-haired woman hesitated. But my lord, if the covenant binds to her, then every faction in our world will soon know. The throne itself could be challenged. Alexander's eyes shifted toward the far side of the room, where Emily Carter was carefully placing glasses on a table for another group of guests. He watched her quietly for a moment. She looked so ordinary, so unaware of the invisible storm building around her. Then his voice turned colder. That is precisely why no one must harm her. The woman nodded slowly, understanding the meaning behind his tone. Already some among the old families will see her as a threat. The man beside her added quietly, or an opportunity. Alexander's expression hardened slightly. Neither option will be allowed, he said calmly, because from this moment forward, Emily Carter is no longer simply a human waitress. He lifted his gaze again toward the dining hall, his eyes reflecting the golden light of the chandeliers. She is now under the protection of the Vampire King. Emily Carter continued moving between the tables of the Grand Aurora restaurant, trying to focus on her work, but the strange atmosphere in the room refused to fade. Every time she passed a group of guests, she felt their eyes on her. Some of them looked curious, others looked cautious, a few looked openly disturbed, as if they were witnessing something they did not fully understand. She placed a tray of glasses on a nearby table and forced a polite smile for the customers seated there. Good evening. Is there anything else I can bring for you? One of the men shook his head quickly, but his attention was not on the menu. It was on her hand. The bandage on her finger had begun to glow faintly beneath the fabric, though the light was so soft that only those with supernatural senses could notice it. Emily herself remained unaware of it entirely. Across the dining hall, Alexander Voss saw it immediately. The faint pulse of energy traveled through the air like a quiet signal. His ancient instincts recognized it. At once the blood oath had not simply awakened for a moment, it was still reacting, slowly weaving itself around the girl's existence like invisible threads. He leaned slightly back in his chair, observing the room. While appearing perfectly relaxed to the human guests, he looked like a wealthy businessman enjoying dinner. But the vampires in the room could feel the shift in power. The man who had stood beside the silver-haired woman earlier stepped forward again. My lord, he said quietly. Several others have sensed the same thing. The energy surrounding the girl is growing stronger. Alexander's voice remained calm. That is expected. The covenant recognizes her presence now. The silver-haired woman lowered her voice further. Then the rumors will spread before the night ends. The old families will begin searching for her identity. Alexander's eyes moved slowly across the dining hall, until they found Emily again. She was carrying another tray through the crowded room, completely unaware that centuries of hidden politics had suddenly begun moving around her life like a rising storm. Let them search, he replied quietly, but they will find nothing without my permission. The man hesitated with concern. My lord, there are factions who will not respect your protection if they believe the throne itself could be threatened. Alexander's gaze sharpened slightly. Anyone who challenges my authority will regret the decision. His words were soft, yet the weight behind them was unmistakable. Across the room, Emily finished serving another table and turned toward the service counter. Her mind was beginning to settle again after the earlier confrontation. The restaurant had returned to its usual rhythm, and for a moment, she almost convinced herself that the strange tension she felt earlier had simply been stress from the incident with the drunken guest. But as she passed near Alexander Voss' table again, a sudden warmth spread through the bandaged finger on her hand. She stopped walking and glanced down. The feeling was not painful, it was more like a gentle pulse traveling from the small cut into the rest of her hand. She flexed her fingers uncertainly. What was that? She whispered quietly. At the same moment, Alexander felt the same pulse echo through his own wrist beneath his skin. The ancient mark flickered once more, invisible to human eyes, but unmistakable to him. The connection between them was growing stronger, even though the girl herself did not realize it. He stood slowly from his chair, causing several nearby guests to pause in mid-conversation. His presence alone commanded attention as he walked calmly toward Emily Carter. She looked up as he approached, unsure whether she had made another mistake. Sir, she began quietly, did I forget something at your table? Alexander stopped a few feet away, studying her with the calm focus of someone examining a mystery that had not yet revealed its full truth. No, Miss Carter, he said gently, I believe the evening has simply become more complicated than either of us expected. Emily blinked in confusion, but before she could ask what he meant, the large glass doors of the restaurant opened suddenly. The same drunken guest from earlier had returned, but this time he was not alone. Two large men in dark suits walked beside him, and their expressions were far from friendly. The man pointed directly toward Emily. There she is, he said loudly. I told you that girl embarrassed me in front of everyone. The room fell silent again as the tension returned. Instantly, several guests shifted in their seats, realizing the confrontation was about to begin once more. But this time the situation was very different, because Alexander Voss was already standing beside her, and everyone in the room could feel the quiet power radiating from him as he prepared to defend the girl under his protection. The moment the drunken guests stepped back into the Grand Aurora restaurant, the air inside the room seemed to freeze once again. Conversation stopped halfway through sentences. Glasses remained suspended in midair as diners slowly turned their heads toward the entrance. The man who had caused trouble earlier looked angrier than before. His expensive jacket hung open, and his face carried the red stain of wounded pride. Behind him stood two men, nearly a foot taller than Emily Carter. Both wore dark suits and moved with the heavy confidence of men who solve problems with their fists rather than their words. That is the girl, the guest said loudly, pointing across the room. She humiliated me earlier in front of everyone. I want her thrown out of this place now. Emily felt her stomach tighten. The tray in her hands trembled slightly as she took a step backward. Instinct told her this situation was about to become much worse. The manager near the counter looked trapped between fear and responsibility, but he still did not move. None of the other staff stepped forward either, because Alexander Voss was already standing there, and everyone present could sense that the situation no longer belonged to the restaurant staff, it belonged to him. The drunken guest pointed again toward Emily. There she is, he repeated. Go bring her here. The two large men began walking forward, pushing through the crowd of tables with heavy steps. Their eyes were fixed on Emily, as if she were an object rather than a person. Emily's heart began to race. She looked around quickly, unsure where to go, but every path seemed blocked by curious diners watching the confrontation unfold. Just as the men reached the center of the room, Alexander Voss moved. He did not rush, he did not raise his voice, he simply stepped forward, placing himself between Emily Carter and the approaching men. The movement was calm, but it carried the same quiet authority that had stopped the entire room earlier. The two large men halted automatically, even though no one had ordered them to stop. Alexander's gaze remained steady on them. That is far enough, he said quietly. The drunken guest laughed from the doorway. Are you serious right now? Move aside, this has nothing to do with you. Alexander Voss did not even look toward him. His attention remained on the two men in front of him, If you take another step, he said calmly, you will regret it. One of the large men frowned, clearly irritated by the interruption. We are not here for you, he said. We are here to collect the girl. Emily felt her breath catch at the coldness in his voice. She looked up at Alexander, unsure what he would do next. The bandaged cut on her finger suddenly pulsed with warmth again, spreading a strange sensation through her hand. At the same moment, Alexander felt the ancient mark beneath his wrist flare once more, reacting to her presence. The connection between them strengthened again, like an invisible thread pulling tighter through the air. His voice became even colder. The girl is not yours to collect. The second large man stepped forward anyway, clearly confident in his strength. Listen, friend, he said with a smirk, step aside before this gets ugly. That was when something in the room changed. The chandeliers above flickered slightly, though no wind moved through the restaurant. A cold silence settled over the crowd. Several of the hidden vampires seated around the room watched with sharp attention because they could feel the ancient power gathering around their king. Alexander Voss lifted his gaze, slowly meeting the eyes of the man who had stepped forward. You should choose your next action very carefully, he said quietly, because the moment you touch her, the situation will change forever. The drunken guest scoffed loudly from behind them. Stop talking and grab her already. The man closest to Emily reached out his hand toward her arm. The moment his fingers moved within inches of her, Alexander Voss' hand closed around the man's wrist with supernatural speed. The movement was so fast that most of the human guests did not even see it happen. 1 second the man had been reaching forward, the next second his arm was locked in Alexander's grip. The large man's expression shifted from confidence to shock as he tried to pull away, but the grip holding him felt like steel. The other bodyguard stepped forward, instantly ready to intervene, but stopped when he saw Alexander's eyes. For a brief moment, they were no longer calm gray. They burned with a deep crimson glow that carried the weight of centuries of power. The room fell into absolute silence. Then Alexander Voss spoke again, his voice quiet but impossible to challenge. She is under my protection, and anyone who threatens her threatens the vampire king himself. The dining hall of the Grand Aurora restaurant fell into a silence so deep that even the faint hum of the city outside seemed to disappear. Alexander Voss still held the bodyguard wrist in his grip, and the man could not move no matter how much strength he used. The difference in power was undeniable. Guests around the room stared in stunned disbelief, because the scene unfolding before them no longer looked like a normal confrontation between wealthy patrons. It felt like something older, something far more dangerous. The second bodyguard stood frozen, his eyes locked on Alexander's face where the brief crimson glow had just faded back to calm gray. He did not understand what he had seen, but every instinct in his body warned him not to move. The drunken guest near the entrance, however, was too angry to notice the warning signs. What kind of ridiculous threat is that, he shouted across the room. A vampire king, he mocked. Do you expect anyone here to believe that nonsense? Several human diners laughed nervously, unsure whether the statement had been a joke or a threat. But the vampires hidden among the guests did not laugh. At 3 separate tables, elegant figures had gone perfectly still. Their eyes had widened in quiet shock, because they had heard those words clearly, and they knew exactly what they meant. The silver-haired woman who had spoken with Alexander earlier stepped forward from the far side of the room, her voice calm but firm. That is enough, she said. The drunken guest turned toward her with irritation. Who are you supposed to be, she asked without raising her voice. Someone who understands the consequences of what you are doing. The 2 bodyguards glanced at each other uneasily. The one trapped in Alexander's grip could feel the impossible strength holding him in place, and a slow realization began spreading through his mind that this situation was far beyond a normal dispute between customers. Meanwhile, Emily Carter stood only a few feet behind Alexander, completely stunned by what she had just heard. Vampire King, she whispered under her breath. Her mind rejected the idea immediately. It sounded like something from a fantasy novel, not something that could exist in a luxury restaurant in Manhattan. Yet the tension in the room felt real. The fear in the eyes of several guests looked real. Even the strange warmth spreading through the bandaged cut on her finger felt real. Alexander finally released the bodyguard wrist. The man stumbled backward, immediately rubbing his arm as if trying to restore feeling to his fingers. The mark on his skin looked like a deep bruise, already forming, though Alexander had barely squeezed him. Leave this place, he said quietly. Take your employer and walk away while you still can. The second bodyguard quickly stepped beside his partner, clearly ready to retreat, but the drunken guest refused to accept defeat. He pointed toward Emily again. "This is ridiculous," he shouted. "She embarrassed me in front of everyone, and I want her fired." Or worse, the word worse hung in the air like a shadow. Several diners shifted uneasily at the cruelty behind it. That was when the silver-haired woman stepped fully into the center of the room. Her calm expression had changed into something sharper, something authoritative. "You do not understand the situation," she said slowly. The drunken guest scoffed. "I understand perfectly. This is just some rich man protecting a waitress." Her gaze moved briefly toward Alexander before returning to the man at the door. "No," she said quietly, "this is the ruler of our world protecting someone who now stands under his ancient covenant." The room erupted with whispers. The hidden vampires present could no longer pretend ignorance. They knew exactly what she meant. If the blood oath had awakened, then the human girl was no longer an ordinary server. She had become a living symbol tied to the very foundation of vampire law. The drunken guest laughed again, trying to dismiss the tension, but the sound came out weaker than before. "Ancient covenant? What are you even talking about?" The silver-haired woman answered him with chilling calm. "I am talking about the law that binds every vampire family across this continent, and the law states clearly that anyone who harms the chosen bloodline will face the full judgment of the Vampire King." A ripple of unease spread through the room. The bodyguards looked toward their employer, uncertain whether they should stay or leave, because even they could sense that the balance of power had shifted dramatically. Meanwhile, Emily Carter stood frozen beside Alexander Voss, trying to understand how her ordinary evening had turned into a moment where strangers spoke about ancient covenants and kings as if they were facts. Alexander's voice finally broke the silence. Again, his tone remained calm, but carried a final authority. "This conversation is finished. Leave now, or the consequences will not be limited to embarrassment in a restaurant." The drunken guest hesitated for the first time since entering the room, because deep inside, even he could feel that the man standing before him was not bluffing, and the power protecting the quiet waitress behind him was far greater than he had ever imagined. For several long seconds, no one in the Grand Aurora restaurant moved. The drunken guest stood near the entrance, staring at Alexander Voss, while the weight of the warning settled over him like a cold shadow. The two bodyguards beside him had already taken half a step backward. Their earlier confidence had vanished, replaced by the quiet instinct of men who suddenly understood they were standing in front of something far more dangerous than an ordinary businessman. Around the dining hall, the hidden vampires watched with silent attention because they knew this moment carried more meaning than a simple argument between customers. The authority of the Vampire King had been spoken openly in front of witnesses, and the ancient covenant had been acknowledged. That kind of declaration could not be taken back. The drunken guest forced a laugh, but the sound lacked conviction. "This is absurd," he said loudly, trying to recover control of the situation. "I came here to enjoy dinner, not to listen to stories about kings and covenants." He pointed toward Emily Carter again. "She is just a waitress, and I want her gone from this place." Emily felt her face grow warm under the attention of the entire room. She had never been the center of so many eyes before, and the strange conversation about ancient laws and vampire kings made her head spin. She looked toward Alexander, uncertain what to do next. Alexander, however, did not turn toward her. His calm gaze remained fixed on the man near the door. "You were given a chance to leave peacefully," he said quietly. "That chance is ending now." The drunken guest opened his mouth to argue again, but the silver-haired woman spoke first. Her voice carried the quiet authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed. "You should listen to him," she said firmly. "If you walk away now, tonight will be remembered as a misunderstanding. If you refuse, you will discover why the throne of the Vampire King has remained unchallenged for centuries." The bodyguards exchanged another uneasy glance. One of them leaned closer to their employer and whispered something too quiet for the humans in the room to hear, but the meaning was clear. Even they had begun to understand that the situation had crossed into territory they could not control. The drunken guest hesitated, and that hesitation was enough to reveal the fear beginning to creep into his mind. He looked around the restaurant, expecting support from other wealthy patrons, but what he saw instead were cautious faces and careful distance. No one wanted to stand against the man in the center of the room. Finally, the bodyguard who had been grabbed earlier spoke quietly. "Sir, we should go." The words were simple, but they carried a final warning. The drunken guest glared at Alexander one last time, anger and humiliation battling with the instinct for self-preservation. "This is not over," he muttered. "You will regret embarrassing me in front of everyone." Alexander's voice remained calm. "I rarely regret defending someone who deserves protection. The man clenched his fists, but said nothing more. He turned sharply and walked toward the exit, pushing past the heavy glass doors with enough force to make them swing wide. The two bodyguards followed him, immediately eager to leave the strange, oppressive atmosphere. Inside the restaurant, the doors closed again, and the silence that followed felt completely different from the tension before. This time, it carried relief. A quiet breath seemed to pass through the entire room. At once, diners slowly returned to their conversations, though their voices remained hushed, as if the presence of Alexander Voss demanded respect. Even in ordinary moments, Emily Carter lowered her tray onto a nearby table, her hands still shaking slightly. "I do not understand what just happened," she said softly. Alexander finally turned toward her. The intensity in his eyes had softened, but the ancient awareness behind them remained sharp. "There are many things in this world that most people never see," he said quietly. "Tonight, you accidentally stepped into one of them." Emily frowned slightly. "I did not mean to cause any trouble." "You did not cause it," he replied. "You simply revealed something that has been hidden for a very long time." Across the room, several of the vampires who had witnessed the mark earlier watched them closely because they understood exactly what he meant. The blood oath had recognized her, and that meant the ancient connection between the throne and a human bloodline had awakened once more. Alexander studied Emily Carter for another moment before speaking again. "From this moment forward, your life may become far more complicated than you expected, but you will not face those complications alone, because the protection I promised earlier was not a threat, it was a vow, and the vow of the Vampire King is never broken." The quiet atmosphere inside the Grand Aurora restaurant slowly returned after the confrontation ended, but the tension beneath the surface had not disappeared. Emily Carter stood beside the service counter, still trying to understand the words Alexander Voss had spoken only moments earlier. His vow echoed in her mind with strange weight. "The protection I promised earlier was not a threat, it was a vow, and the vow of the Vampire King is never broken." She looked at him uncertainly as the other diners began speaking again in soft, careful voices. "You keep saying things like that," she said quietly, "as if they are normal, but none of this makes sense." Alexander studied her expression for a moment, as if measuring how much truth she could handle in a single evening. "It does not make sense because the world you know is only a small part of the truth," he replied calmly. Emily shook her head slightly. "I am just a waitress. I work double shifts to help my mother pay rent. I do not belong in whatever world you are talking about." Before Alexander could answer, the silver-haired woman approached again, her expression thoughtful. "My lord," she said softly, "the message has already begun spreading. The others in the city have felt the oath awaken." Alexander nodded slowly. "I expected as much." The man who had been standing beside her earlier spoke with concern. "Once the elder families learn the covenant has chosen a human again, they will begin asking questions." Alexander's eyes moved briefly toward Emily, who stood only a few steps away, trying not to listen, but unable to ignore the conversation. "Let them ask," he said quietly. "Their questions will not change the law." The silver-haired woman lowered her voice further. "But my lord, the last time the blood oath awakened, the consequences nearly destroyed the council. The human bloodline was hunted by half the noble houses." Alexander's expression remained calm, but a cold edge sharpened his voice. "That mistake will not be repeated." Emily finally stepped forward. "I do not understand what you are all talking about," she said nervously. "What bloodline? What covenant?" Everyone fell silent for a moment. The silver-haired woman glanced at Alexander, as if asking permission to speak. He gave a slight nod. "Emily Carter," she began gently, "more than 2 centuries ago, a human woman saved the life of the Vampire King at a time when enemies nearly destroyed his kingdom. As repayment, an ancient oath was sworn. That oath bound the throne to protect the bloodline of that woman forever." Emily stared at her in disbelief. "That sounds like a story, not something real." The woman continued calmly. "Magic sealed that promise. Whenever a descendant of that bloodline is threatened, the oath awakens to protect them." Emily looked down at the bandage on her finger, remembering the strange warmth she had felt earlier. "You are saying that person is me?" Alexander's voice answered quietly. "The oath believes so." Emily laughed softly from pure confusion. "That is impossible. My family has never been part of anything like that. My mother works in a hospital laundry. My grandmother used to teach music lessons in a small town in Ohio." Alexander folded his hands calmly. That may be true, yet the magic in your blood does not lie. Emily looked around the room again, noticing that several guests were watching the conversation with intense interest. The strange weight of their attention made her uneasy. Why would anyone care about something that happened 200 years ago? She asked quietly. Because power does not forget, the silver-haired woman answered softly. If the ancient covenant truly binds you to the throne, then harming you would be considered an act of war against the vampire king. Emily felt a chill run through her body. War, she whispered. Alexander stepped closer, his voice calm but firm. Which is why you must understand something very clearly, Miss Carter. From this moment forward, there will be individuals who wish to control you, and others who may wish to eliminate you before the oath can fully awaken. Emily stared at him, her heart beginning to race again. Why would anyone want to hurt me? Because of an old promise. Alexander's eyes darkened slightly. Because that promise binds the authority of the throne itself, and in the hidden world of vampires, anyone connected to that authority becomes either an ally or a threat. He paused for a moment before adding quietly, tonight the oath protected you once, but there are many in our world who will not accept that protection easily, and the moment they discover who you are, the real danger will begin. Emily Carter stood motionless beside the service counter while the weight of Alexander Voss' words settled slowly into her thoughts. The real danger will begin. The sentence echoed in her mind with quiet certainty, and it made the warm lights of the Grand Aurora restaurant suddenly feel colder than before. She looked around the dining hall again, but the place that had seemed elegant and ordinary only an hour earlier now felt like a stage, hiding secrets beneath every table and every whisper. I still do not understand, she said quietly. I have lived the same life for 24 years. Nothing about my family is special. My mother works long hours. My father passed away when I was young. We never had anything to do with ancient promises or kings. Alexander listened patiently. As she spoke, his expression remained calm, but his attention was focused completely on her, as if he were studying every detail of her words. Sometimes the truth hides in the past, he replied gently. A bloodline can travel through generations without anyone realizing what it carries. Emily folded her arms uncertainly. You are saying someone in my family saved your life 2 centuries ago? Alexander nodded once. Yes, the woman who created the covenant was named Eleanor Carter. Emily blinked in surprise. Carter, that is my last name. Alexander's voice remained steady. Her courage protected the throne during one of the darkest moments in our history. Without her intervention, the vampire king would have fallen and the council would have collapsed. Emily tried to imagine such a moment, but the idea felt too distant, too unreal. If that happened 200 years ago, then how could anyone know that I am connected to her? The silver-haired woman answered softly. Because the oath itself remembers. Blood magic does not forget promises. Emily glanced down again at the bandage on her finger, remembering the strange pulse that had traveled through her hand earlier. You mean the cut on my finger caused all of this? The oath awakened when your blood touched mine, Alexander said quietly. For centuries the mark remained silent, waiting for a descendant of Eleanor Carter to appear again. Emily shook her head slowly. This is too much. I came to work tonight expecting nothing more dramatic than spilled wine and late customers. Now you are telling me I am connected to an ancient covenant with a king of vampires. She let out a nervous breath. I feel like I stepped into someone else's story. Alexander studied her carefully. That feeling will pass. The truth is not changing whether it feels comfortable or not. Before Emily could respond, the large glass doors of the restaurant opened again, but this time the arrival did not bring shouting or anger. Instead, 3 elegantly dressed figures entered quietly. Their movements were graceful and deliberate, like people who understood exactly how much attention they were drawing. The silver-haired woman stiffened slightly. My lord, she murmured, the council observers have arrived. Alexander turned slowly toward the entrance. His expression remained calm, but Emily noticed the subtle tension in his posture. The 3 newcomers walked across the room without speaking until they stopped several feet away. The tallest of them, a man with pale skin and sharp blue eyes, inclined his head respectfully. Your Majesty, he said, we felt the awakening of the blood oath across the city. Alexander replied simply, I assumed you would. The man gaze shifted toward Emily Carter, and for the first time, she felt something colder than curiosity in someone's eyes. It was calculation. So this is the descendant, he said quietly. Emily felt a chill run through her spine, because the way he looked at her felt less like meeting a person and more like examining an object of importance. The second Observer: a woman dressed in dark velvet spoke next. The council will demand confirmation of her identity. The awakening of the covenant changes the balance of power. Alexander voice remains steady. The law is clear. The oath recognized her. That is confirmation enough. The man with blue eyes hesitated before speaking again, and if the other noble houses refused to accept that law, the dining hall became silent once more because everyone present understood the meaning behind the question. If powerful vampire families decided to challenge the covenant, then the quiet evening inside the restaurant could become the beginning of something far larger. Alexander Voss met the man gaze without hesitation. Then they will discover what happens to anyone who declares war on the throne while standing under my protection. He paused before adding quietly, because the girl you are looking at is no longer simply a waitress working a late shift tonight. She has become the living key to an oath that the vampire world swore never to break. Emily Carter felt as if the entire room had shifted beneath her feet. The words spoken by the council observers echoed through her mind. Living key to an oath that the vampire world swore never to break. Only a few hours earlier, she had been carrying trays of glasses and worrying about whether she would earn enough tips to help her mother pay next month rent. Now powerful strangers spoke about her, as if she had become a symbol inside a hidden world she had never known existed. She looked from one face to another. Alexander Voss, the silver-haired woman, the council observers, and the other silent figures watching from distant tables. None of them looked surprised by the situation. Only she did. This cannot be real, she said quietly, almost to herself. I do not belong in your world. The tall observer with blue eyes watched her carefully. That may be true for now, he said, but the blood oath does not awaken without reason. If the covenant has chosen you, then your existence already influences our world, whether you wish it or not. Emily shook her head slowly. I influence nothing. I serve food, I take orders, I go home and help my mother with bills. That is my entire life. Alexander Voss stepped closer, his presence calm but steady. That life may remain part of who you are, he said, but the oath has changed the path ahead of you. Emily looked up at him, frustration mixing with fear. Why should an ancient promise decide my future? I did not ask for any of this. Alexander's voice softened slightly. Because the promise was not made for your benefit alone, it was made to repay a debt of honor. Eleanor Carter saved a king, and the oath ensured that her descendants would never stand alone when danger appeared. The silver-haired woman added gently, the covenant exists to protect you, not to control you. Emily let out a quiet breath, trying to absorb the explanation, but the council observer spoke again with a tone that carried more urgency. Protection does not erase the consequences, your majesty, he said, turning toward Alexander. Several houses within the council will not welcome the return of the blood oath the moment word spreads across the continent. Some will see the girl as a threat to their influence. Alexander met the man gaze calmly. Then they will remember the law that governs every house in this world. The second observer, a woman dressed in dark velvet, spoke quietly. The law may exist, but history shows that ambition often ignores the law. The last time a human bloodline stood this close to the throne, there were assassins. Within weeks, Emily's heart skipped a beat. Assassins. The words sounded unreal, but the seriousness in their voices made it impossible to dismiss. Alexander did not react with surprise. He had expected this possibility from the moment the mark awakened, which is why she will not remain unprotected, he said calmly. The silver-haired woman nodded in agreement. The covenant grants the throne absolute authority over her safety. Emily looked at Alexander again, her voice softer. Now are you saying my life is going to be guarded by vampires from now on? He answered simply, yes. Emily stared at the floor for a moment, absorbing the answer. Then she looked back up with quiet determination. I never wanted power. I never wanted enemies. I only wanted a normal life. Alexander regarded her carefully before speaking. A normal life may still exist for you in many ways, but the oath has revealed a connection that cannot be ignored. There are people in our world who will seek you out either for protection or for advantage. The council observer with blue eyes stepped forward. Again, that is why the council will require a formal confirmation of her bloodline, my lord. The ancient archives must be examined. If she truly descends from Eleanor Carter, then the covenant will bind the throne to her protection without limit. Alexander nodded. Once that confirmation will come, but until that moment arrives, no one approaches her without my permission. The observers exchanged quiet glances, understanding the authority behind the declaration. Finally, the man with blue eyes bowed his head Slightly, then the council will wait for your command, your majesty. The three observers turned and left the restaurant as quietly as they had arrived, leaving the room filled with uneasy silence. Once more Emily Carter looked at Alexander Voss with a mixture of disbelief and reluctant trust. My entire life changed in one night, she said softly. Alexander met her gaze calmly. Some destinies wait generations before revealing themselves tonight. Yours finally did, and whether you welcome it or not, the vampire world will soon realize that the girl standing in this restaurant is now protected by the oldest oath ever sworn to the throne. The dining hall of the Grand Aurora restaurant slowly returned to quiet conversation after the council observers departed, yet the feeling in the air had changed forever. Emily Carter stood beside Alexander Voss for several moments, without speaking, trying to absorb the reality that had unfolded around her. The elegant room that once felt intimidating now seemed almost unreal, as if she were watching someone else's life from a distance. Finally, she spoke in a softer voice. So what happens now? Alexander looked toward the tall windows where the lights of Manhattan stretched across the night, like a sea of gold and white. The city continued moving outside, completely unaware that an ancient covenant had awakened inside one of its restaurants. Tonight, nothing else will happen, he said calmly. You will finish your shift, you will return home, and your life will continue. Emily studied him carefully. That sounds simple, but everything you told me does not feel simple. Alexander allowed the faintest hint of a smile. That is because the truth rarely is. The silver-haired woman, who had remained nearby, stepped forward one last time. Miss Carter, the oath exists to protect you, but protection does not mean your freedom disappears. You will still make your own choices. Emily considered those words slowly. That means I can keep my job. You may keep any part of your life that you wish. Alexander answered. The covenant does not claim ownership, it promises protection. She let out a quiet breath that she had been holding since the confrontation began. Good, because I cannot imagine explaining this night to my manager. Emily glanced toward the service counter where Rachel and the other staff members were whispering excitedly while pretending to polish glasses. They clearly knew something unusual had happened, even if they did not understand the truth. Alexander followed her gaze briefly. Humans are very good at explaining strange events with ordinary reasons, he said softly. Tomorrow most of them will decide they witnessed nothing more than a wealthy patron defending a waitress from an unpleasant customer. Emily nodded slowly. That explanation sounds much easier to accept than the real one. There was a moment of quiet understanding between them. Then Emily looked at him again with a question that had been forming in her mind since the oath awakened. What about you? She asked. You said my ancestors saved your life 200 years ago. Does that mean you remember? Her Alexander gaze softened with the weight of distant memory. Yes, I remember Eleanor Carter very clearly. He paused for a moment before continuing. She was brave in a way few humans ever are. When my enemies surrounded the castle, she stood between them and the throne. Even though she knew the risk, Emily imagined that moment, trying to picture a woman with her family name standing before creatures of the night with nothing but courage. It sounds like she was stronger than I am. Alexander shook his head gently. Strength appears in different forms. Sometimes it is the courage to face danger. Sometimes it is the patience to continue living an ordinary life while carrying an extraordinary legacy. Emily smiled faintly at that answer. I guess I will need both from now on. That would be wise, he said. The restaurant manager finally approached them, looking slightly nervous, but trying to maintain professional composure. Miss Carter, he said carefully, if you are ready, there are still a few tables waiting. Emily glanced at Alexander, then back at the manager. I will be there in a moment, she promised. The manager nodded quickly and returned to the dining room, leaving them alone again. Emily adjusted the tray in her hands, preparing to step away, but she paused before leaving. Thank you, she said quietly, for protecting me tonight. Alexander met her eyes with calm certainty. The covenant demanded that protection, but the decision was mine, and I would make the same choice again. Emily held his gaze for a moment longer, then nodded before returning to her work among the tables. The night continued as if nothing extraordinary had happened, but every hidden vampire in the restaurant understood the truth. The blood oath had awakened again, and the human descendant of Eleanor Carter now walked the world under the protection of the Vampire King. And somewhere within the ancient laws that governed the vampire world, a promise written 2 centuries earlier had finally been fulfilled, proving that even the coldest kings still honored the courage of a human heart.